Soon after his arrival, he attends a communist meeting and he impresses party officials who offer him the job of editor of the Harlem edition of the Daily Worker. In Harlem, the vast majority of African Americans live in a thickly populated section of New York, overflowing with nearly 500,000 people. This is the largest concentration of African Americans in the nation. Many of them are cornered by poverty like African Americans in Chicago. Over the next year, Wright edits the newspaper by day, and in the evening he stays late in the tiny office working on his short stories to meet a contest deadline from Story magazine. His manuscript, Uncle Tom's Children, is a collection of 4 stories about the terror that racism brings to the lives of African Americans in Mississippi. In February 1938, the contest selection committee, including famous American novelist Sinclair Lewis, picks Wright's material over 500 contestants and awards him the literary prize of $500. Soon after this achievement, the magazine submits his material to Harper's Publishers in New York, and the company issues him a contract. After sales reach nearly 75,000, the publisher offers Wright a new book deal, and he begins work on another novel. He now has a national reputation and is recognized as one of America's most influential African American writers. Then, in 1939, after a recommendation from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, he wins the highly coveted Guggenheim Fellowship for Artists and is awarded the $2,500 prize. Wright is now spending the majority of his time completing his next novel. For him, the creative process is slow and hard. He sweats over his work. When Native Son is released in March 1940, sales climb over 200,000 in less than 3 weeks. Through his main character, Bigger Thomas, Wright describes how living in poor conditions with no way out produces thundering violence and murder.
In Bigger Thomas, I was not trying to show a type of Negro, but even more than that, a human being reacting under pressure, reacting the only way he could because of his environment that offers few avenues out.
I think Native Son was well received because everyone could sort of see some of Bigger Thomas in themselves, especially African Americans. African Americans could relate to that sense of despair, to that sense of desperation, to that sense of fear that Bigger Thomas had for his future and for the future of his people, for his ability to be able to be successful in the society, in a racist society, in a society where poverty was rampant, in a black belt or in a ghetto situation where you live with your parent, you still live with your mother, you still had other obligations, you were definitely looked at as one of the breadwinners of the family. So you had pressures put upon you by society and by your family as well. So Richard Wright wrote Native Son from some of the experiences that he remembered from his early days in Mississippi, from his days in South Side of Chicago, from his experiences with the Communist Party in when he was with the Postal Service, and also from this South Side Chicago Boys Club, where he was able to really listen to some of the stories and some of the conversations of young blacks who to him seemed headed for a doom, seemed very much candidates for the insane asylums, for the prisons, for even the electric chair of the State House. That he saw and he listened to their conversations as conversations that were hopeless.
I look upon fiction and writing in general as a means of revealing the truth of life and experience rather than purely as a means of entertaining people.
The next year, Wright marries Rose Dima Meadman, a white classical dancer, and aspiring writer Ralph Ellison is best man. but the marriage is short-lived and they divorce a year later. Then, in 1941, he marries Ellen Poplar, a white Communist Party organizer from Brooklyn. Wright continues his commitment to the underclass when he publishes 12 Million Black Voices in 1941. Through pictures and words, he documents the hardships African Americans meet migrating from the South to the North in the early 1900s. Wright pleads for African Americans to embrace African culture as a basis for identity, and he uses the word black nearly 22 years before it is popular in the 1960s. Commenting on race relations, Wright says, "Even though we have been told that we need not be afraid, we have lived so long in fear of all white faces that we cannot help but sit and wait." Wright's analysis draws close scrutiny from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who orders agents to watch him. Later in the year, the NAACP awards him the Spingarn Award, bestowed annually on an African American who demonstrates professional excellence. The next year, the Wrights' first child, Julia, is born. Racial stress continues to grow, and by the summer of 1943, there have been many violent outbreaks.
Blacks began to see as the custodians of their oppression individual property and businesses of whites that were in their community. They saw these things as symbols of their oppression, and they attacked these institutions. They attacked these businesses. Instead of attacking whites themselves, they began to attack the businesses. We saw this happen in 1935, but we saw the explosion of this in 1942, where property damage was rampant. Property damage was very much expensive, very much widespread, and more importantly, very much relegated to the black community itself. It did not leave the black community.
The ghetto should be eliminated. The people need to receive education and training for decent jobs. Poor social conditions produce certain psychological reactions.
By 1944, Wright is disillusioned with the Communist Party and leaves after he is convinced it is just as oppressive as capitalism and when it won't tackle African American issues. The next year, Wright releases Black Boy, a partially autobiographical story about his childhood. It sheds light on how a child's innocence is shattered after exposure to racism. Black Boy also explores how literacy gives a person the confidence to surmount a restrictive environment. His book is a huge success and gets positive coverage in the New York Times. It is a Book of the Month Club selection.
Black Boy was successful for some of the same reasons that Native Son was successful. Even though it was Black Boy was his early life, that many blacks could, or many people could relate to those kinds of situations that he presented in Black Boy. The poverty, the lack of education, the lack of good schooling, good housing, the lack of opportunity.